A few days ago, on November 9th, 2025, Soundgarden was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And when I was younger, I used to think this was a really big deal. I don't really care anymore. I used to think, oh, Judas Priest or whoever, I thought was an underdog band should get credit, and I'm sure a lot of those bands, appreciate these types of awards. But I personally, I don't really care that much. But there's definitely an irony to it because the whole grunge thing was kind of an anti-rock star thing, right? I mean, if you were a follower of grunge early on, early 90s, and you watched interviews and stuff, there was always this kind of cynical humor going on, where they would make fun of rock stars and rock star cliches. And it's just very ironic to look back and see how basically what they were, it was a marketing scheme, if not in real time, in retrospect, it was the marketing of, satire. You take like Spinal Tap, right? A joke band, a movie, a satirical movie making fun of rock and roll. And then they end up influencing bands. And, Soundgarden was one of the many bands that covered Spinal Tap and kind of turned it into this new thing to replace the old thing. And then it ends up being the same bloated corporate thing that they were making fun of in the beginning. One could argue. Now, my feeling is that if there's talent there and the band's good, give them all the awards that can be given. I don't take anything away from any band that has actual talent that's good. It's when the band sucks that it bothers me a little more. But even so, I'm just kind of indifferent to it all. I mean, whatever. I don't know who any of these people are. I mean, who knows? They're all like industry people stuff. Anyway, to have Jim Carrey host, I think, first of all, accurately speaks to the ironic, satirical, I guess you could say, mentality of the members of the grunge scene, whether it's, Alice in Chains or Pearl Jam or Nirvana, Soundgarden. You look at interviews over the years, and there's this common theme of sort of mocking what they are and what they're doing, while at the same time, to varying degrees, paying homage to it and appreciating it. But here's the problem I have. I believe Chris Cornell was murdered. And I believe that the people in charge of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or whatever, the industry people, somebody in the industry put a hit on Chris Cornell, somebody in there. And when I watch something like this, what I see is mockery. What I see is, oh, ha ha ha, we didn't kill him. He killed himself, and we're just going to pretend. And so from that perspective, I see mockery. I feel like I'm being mocked when I watch this. Now, I know everyone doesn't feel that way, but if you're curious why I believe that Chris Cornell was murdered, or at the very least that the news media completely lied to the public about it, that I can prove. And I do it in my video, which I will link in the description here. It's one of my most popular videos. It's called Chris Cornell Death, A Look at the Evidence. And if you're interested, I will show you the publicly available evidence. I will analyze it, and I will show you why I believe he was murdered. So in that sense, to me, this is kind of a mockery. And the fact that his relatives and his friends and supposed friends and bandmates all participate in tells me two things. Either these people are all too afraid to say anything, or they are part of the same sick entertainment culture. And in that world, nobody, who's real and who's fake, I don't know. Are they all just acting? Are they all schizophrenic? Are they all sociopaths? I don't know. But I can't get past that. And it bothers me the whole time I'm watching this. Now, Jim Carrey has been known to support underground rock music, although I don't know if we could call this underground because they're getting a Hall of Fame induction. But it is known that, or at least we're told, that the band Cannibal Corpse appeared in the movie Ace Ventura because Jim Carrey liked them and called them up. Now, that could be bullshit, but it does at least show that Jim Carrey was paying attention to music that wasn't considered mainstream back then. So I think that needs to be said, and it's it's fair to say that Jim Carrey probably appreciated music of that era, as he says he does here. I think that's probably genuine. But outside of that, I really don't see what direct connection he has with the band other than this little story he says about meeting Chris Cornell. I think that there's lots of people that they could have gotten that were a lot more qualified, that would have made a lot more sense to fans than Jim Carrey. So whatever. I don't know exactly what that all means, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. Jim Carrey tells a story here about how he's the one who asked Soundgarden, or asked the Saturday Night Live people to have Soundgarden on their show once. And he says after the show, they gave him this guitar and the whole band signed it. And this is all backwards because whoever uploaded this video, the screen got flipped in reverse. So all these signatures are in reverse. But I was looking for Chris Cornell's signature, and I'm guessing that at this time, he didn't sign his name this way. You see, this is the way Chris Cornell signed his name around the time he died, which I always thought was a really peculiar signature. You can see it almost has like a shape to it that, you know, in one sense suits his character. There was a cryptic, kind of mysterious side to Chris Cornell, without a doubt. And his signature hints at something kind of cryptic, especially when you look at this right here. I always thought this album cover, To Higher Truth, was one of the more indicative of the whole Illuminati thing. And his signature almost looks like an upside down pyramid, getting into, you know, that whole occult symbology thing. Now, that could mean nothing. I could just be looking too much into it, but I thought that was worth mentioning because I don't see anything that looks like that signature on here. So maybe someone can blow it up and look a little closer and tell me which one it is. And obviously, he didn't sign his autograph that way back then. I'd be curious to know when he started doing that. And here we have Lily Cornell, Chris Cornell's oldest daughter, who he had with Susan Silver, his first wife. Now, he was with Susan Silver in the beginning, before Soundgarden was famous. She was managing the band. She was also managing Alice in Chains, and I think another band that lost a singer. So it's something about Susan Silver managing bands whose singers die. That bothers me a little bit. I've never really looked into it, but someday I may. In the little research I've done, I haven't gotten any far with that. I haven't really been able to find much. But anyway, it's worth noting that Cornell's oldest daughter is here, and Susan Silver's in the audience. He also has a couple kids with Vicky, including a blonde boy who's very blonde, Chris Jr. And I speak about him in a different blog. Maybe I'll put a link to that in the description. I don't know if I believe that kid is Chris Cornell's. He looks kind of like Chris Cornell in a way, but I can't get past the whole very, very blonde hair thing. I don't believe either. Chris Cornell doesn't have blonde hair, and neither does Vicky. So I don't know where that came from. Maybe it skipped a generation. That's something I get into in a different blog, something to ponder. Chris Cornell actually has a very talented family that nobody seems to know about, including a brother who is an amazing singer in his own right. In fact, I would say he's just as good as Chris Cornell, but he has his own vocal style. And I'll probably talk about him in a future blog. Very interesting family. Chris Cornell came from a musical family of several talented siblings, something that I don't think is that widely known outside of the immediate Seattle circle. Now, obviously, if you're getting into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you are not an underground band, okay? There was a time where Soundgarden was sort of considered, not even sort of, they were considered an underground band, and they prided themselves in that. And what backs that up is the fact that they, well, first were on a compilation called Deep Six, which was a very limited Seattle scene release in like 1986 or something like that. Had a bunch of bands that would become influential later, one of which was Soundgarden. This guy, Hiro Yamato, he's on that. He plays bass on that. But, you know, when we think of Soundgarden hits, the hits that made them famous on the larger scale, we think of Outshine. That was their first big hit, big MTV hit. Although, you know, Louder Than Love was their major label debut. And those songs were on MTV, but you can pick up Louder Than Love and listen to it right now. And I personally like the album. I've got a lot of memories attached to it because I saw Soundgarden on that tour, and I had a very personal connection with the music they made on that album, as well as Ultra Mega OK. But I mean, if we're to be realistic here, nobody really cared too much what Soundgarden was doing on the mass scale until Outshined, which was on the Bad Motorfinger album. Now, it was the next album that really had the big hits, like Spoon Man and Black Hole Sun and Fell on Black Days, which, you know, I admit initially I was disappointed with that album because I wanted something heavier like Bad Motorfinger. But over the years, I've come to appreciate that as well as Down on the Upside. I think they're both actually really good albums. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is that this guy here, Hiro Yamato, the original bass player, he wasn't on any of their big hits at all. He was gone, you know, I think during the Louder Than Love tour. He didn't even make it to 1990. He was gone by 1989. And so I think I find it a little odd that he comes out and he's like the spokesman. And he says, "I am so grateful to be honored here tonight." Well, it's a little bit of an odd statement because, okay, sure, you helped form the band with Chris Cornell. That's great. You deserve status that way. But it's a little arrogant and I think assumptive for him to come out and say, "I'm so grateful to be honored here tonight." He didn't play on Outshined. He didn't play on Spoon Man. He was gone. In fact, this guy is currently the chief of organic chemistry at Edge Analytical in Burlington, Washington. And that's great. You know, he sounds like a very accomplished man with a very accomplished career. But I mean, you know, it sounds like music is his secondary life. And that's fine, but it kind of just feels like he's taking credit here. Why is he doing that? Why is he sort of appointing himself such a significant role when these three guys behind him are far more significant than he is? These three guys here all played on the songs that got them the fame and fortune that is, you know, that led to their induction here. So that's the first strange thing. And then he brings up, you know, being a kid and listening to "I'll Be There" by Michael Jackson and how great memories he has from that. And that's very nice. He's, you know, talking about his past and, you know, being a kid listening to music, and then now he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But again, it just seems a little kind of lame and kind of fake for him to be sort of taking credit. And to be absolutely fair, he's probably the least significant member of the band. I mean, literally the worst Soundgarden song. It's called, and if you don't believe me, go listen to it, okay? It's called "Circle of Power." It's on the album Ultra Mega OK, which the name of the album, according to the band, is basically a description of how underwhelming the album was. It's Ultra Mega OK. You know, it's like this inside joke with the band, although I have my interpretation of that title, which is if you switch the letters around, you can make it say MK Ultra Ego, but that's something I go into in a different blog. So, I mean, Soundgarden, they just weren't that good of a band in the beginning. They were an average, okay, kind of interesting band with an extraordinary singer is what they were. And "Circle of Power" is an awful song that's on Ultra Mega OK. It's the worst song on the album. It's probably Soundgarden's worst song. And my trivia might be a little rusty here, but I believe it's the only song that Hiro Yamato sang and wrote and played. So he sings it. It's the only song he sings. I'm saying that as someone who used to listen to Ultra Mega OK a lot. It's weird because I can sit here and say it's kind of a crappy album, but at the same time say I like it. There's something about it just because I listened to it and I had such a personal connection with that album as a teenager. So I don't hate the album, but I can objectively say that's kind of a crappy album, especially when you take it in perspective with some of their best stuff. You know, "Far Beyond the Wheel" is an amazing song, but the production is pretty crappy on that album. And they actually remixed the entire album, which tells you right there that they knew it sounded crappy and murky. And this is all very well documented. What I'm saying is not necessarily my own opinion. The band feels similar on some levels. especially with regard to the mix, which is why they remixed it. And I have to say, the remixed version, I can sort of see why they called it metal after hearing the remix version. But before that, I didn't understand why they called it metal, because it just didn't have that crisp, chuggy thing that makes metal metal. I couldn't understand why it won any kind of Grammy or anything for a metal category. But I see it now. I hear it now, hearing the remix, because it brings out, and that's a whole strange story unto itself, because the band, as underground as they were already being offered a major label deal. And Jim Carrey sort of brags earlier that, this was the first Seattle band to get a major label deal. That's true. They were the first sort of, we think, underground grunge band to get a major label deal. And that was by A&M in 1988 for Louder Than Love. But they were actually offered a major label deal before that. They were offered a major label deal, I think, by A&M to release Ultra Mega OK, and the band said, no, let's not do that. We want to work our way up to that. Now, what band has the luxury to make that decision? Like, oh no, we want to be in the underground a little longer, but you just wait there, major label, and we'll catch up to you next year when we're ready to be big rocks. We're not quite ready to be big rock stars yet. And they opted to go with SST, a record label that is notorious for murky, shitty sounding albums. And they took pride in that because it was the underground. So, I think that Soundgarden kind of did that, or whoever was in charge of Soundgarden, or the think tank behind Soundgarden, was kind of contriving the band to appear perhaps more underground than they actually were. And that the plan was to emerge them as if organically out of the underground, when in fact they already had the opportunity there. And they were, I don't necessarily believe that Soundgarden was, especially when you consider that Kim Thale was personal friends with, I think it was Bruce Pavitt, the guy who helped found Sub Pop, the magazine and the record label. Again, that could all be very organic, but it could also be that Kim Thale and that guy, were part of some type of intelligence organization that planned all this to move to Seattle to sort of contrive the whole Seattle scene from the start. Kim Thale was very connected. He worked at the college radio station. And by stating all of this, I'm not trying to insinuate that Soundgarden wasn't a good band, or they weren't talented, or they don't deserve this induction here. But the fact is, again, they weren't that great of a band. They were an okay band, some might say below average, with an extraordinary singer. But Cornell's songwriting ability wouldn't come out until later. And of course, Matt Cameron was more than a competent drummer and ended up being a phenomenal drummer, I would say, later, by the time of Bad Motorfinger. So Hiro Yamato's speech is not very long, but he launches right into this thing about how he's Japanese and his parents were placed into prison camps just for being Japanese during World War II. Well, the fact is, Japan was aligned with Nazi Germany during World War II. So, that's not to say that his family deserved to be put in prison camps, but I think the context of World War II is significant. The fact that Japan was aligned with Nazi Germany at that time. It's not something you just sort of leave out. I mean, you can, but what is behind, Hiro Yamato saying this is, he says, well, that affected my life greatly, and it really echoes strongly today. Well, why does it echo strongly today, Hiro? Well, I know what he's saying. What he's saying is that because so many illegal aliens are being deported right now by ICE, and because the mainstream media is portraying ICE as being so evil, well, Hiro Yamato is jumping, he's grabbing a surfboard and surfing right on top of that mainstream narrative and saying, yeah, that's true, and my parents were immigrants too. He's saying just because you're Japanese, you get locked up in a concentration camp, that's the same as what they're doing today with deporting illegals, and it's just not the same thing. And he ends by saying, especially all you brown kids, let's rock. So, the assumption behind that being like, if you're not white, you're being treated badly right now. I don't know. It seems like when you take into account Hiro Yamato's, the fact that he's the least, let's just be honest, the least significant member, other than the fact that he was one of the founders of the band, his contributions are probably are easily the least significant of anyone on that stage as far as why they're being inducted. And yet he's the one pushing this whole racial thing. He's turning it into a racial thing. Passive aggressively calling the country and the current administration racist doesn't make it true. And just because the mainstream media and the establishment echoes what you're saying, doesn't mean that it's correct. In fact, these guys were supposed to be anti-establishment in the beginning. Everyone was like, oh, they're punk rock, they're on SST. That was all anti-establishment. Well, Hiro Yamato is pushing the establishment political message right now. So, I mean, whatever you think of what I'm saying, whether you agree or not, you can't deny that this message, this political message that Hiro Yamato is pushing here, is the establishment media message. And when you're echoing the establishment media, you've got to ask yourself, am I really thinking for myself, or am I just echoing what the propaganda mass media is trying to push? Now, Chris Cornell was half Jewish. He was half Jewish, half Roman Catholic. I didn't hear anyone say anything about Jews, like God bless the Jews or anything, because it's not politically correct right now to say positive things about Jews or white Roman Catholics, which, again, Chris Cornell was half Jewish and half Roman Catholic, Irish. Jim Carrey got famous for being the funny white guy on the show In Living Color, which was a variety show where everyone was black except him. And he often played like a goofy, silly white guy, and he did it really well, and he was really funny. And one of his most famous characters was Fire Marshal Bill, and he goes a little bit into the Fire Marshal Bill routine just for a second when he talks about the guitar that was signed by the band, I think it was in that context. So there's that element as well when we're talking about the racial thing. I don't think it's a coincidence that we're sort of elevating, the brown people in the audience and the persecuted non-whites out there and raising their voices. We're sort of doing that. And at the same time, we've got this kind of clown who's like this sort of making a mockery, a caricature of like white people. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think the people who put this together, they're pushing racial propaganda. And whether you buy the message or not, if it's contrived to get you to think and act a certain way, that's not, there's something disingenuous about that. They're trying to control the way you think. And whether you agree with the message or not, you should ask yourself, why are they trying to control the way I think? Can I not think for myself? Can I not make my own decisions? So Matt Cameron goes up there and gives this kind of dead-eye stare and reads off a list of various individuals and entities, all of which sound very righteous and valid to me. And he just reads a list of thank yous. And then Kim Thale comes in and sort of laughs and thanks Matt Cameron for reading that list because it was so exhaustive. And he's kind of acknowledging that, like, wow, you really, what else do I need to say? But of course, Kim Thale says, thanks to my immigrant parents for encouraging my curiosity of ideas in science and the arts and instilling the values in me that I would also find in Hiro, another son of immigrants, as well as Ben and Matt and Chris. It's kind of like he's elevating himself and Hiro above everyone else by saying, oh, well, we're, children of immigrants. And that's, look, you could look at it two ways. He's just saying it because it's true and he's proud of it, and that's great. But it also happens to be a very heated political climate about immigration right now. So it's very obvious that the two of them are bringing this up to make some kind of political point. The underlining message seeming to be that, well, we acknowledge that there's an anti-immigrant sentiment right now. This is supposed to be about music, and it's supposed to be about Chris Cornell and Soundgarden, because let's be honest, Chris Cornell in a lot of ways was Soundgarden. As far as Chris Cornell's actual death, it's spoken of very briefly. I think Jim Carrey says something like, and then tragically in 2017, we lost Chris, blah, blah, blah. And then he just moves right on, and that's just it. No getting into, details. Let's just celebrate who he was. And that would be all fine and dandy if he wasn't murdered, which I believe he was. So it just puts a little bit of a more than a dark cloud over this whole thing. It puts there's something sinister. It's like the murderers are sitting. The murderers are probably in the audience here watching, snickering to themselves. So then his daughter Toni, Chris Cornell's daughter Toni, who's very pretty, she sings a version of "Fell on Black Days," which I think is one of Chris Cornell's greatest songs, one of the great rock and roll songs of all time, actually. And to me, this song sort of the performance of this song attempts to sort of satiate the whole darkness that surrounds the whole Chris Cornell situation and the death without actually saying it. And unfortunately, I don't mean to be mean, but it's pretty awful, if you ask me. She's not a very good singer. She definitely didn't inherit the gifts her dad has. The music just sounds crappy. I don't think it was very well done. I think it's very pretentious. I think this woman here seems like she's so full of herself. I don't know. I mean, they're probably all coming from a good place. They think, or maybe not. I don't know. Maybe they all know that he was murdered and they're all weirdos in on the weird occult agenda. I really don't know. But I don't like it. I think it was pretty crappy. And, I don't know. It's just, this stuff just kind of makes me sick, to be honest. I hate to be kind of a bummer, kind of a downer. But again, this comes from the perspective that I believe he was murdered, and I believe he was murdered by this industry, the industry that's putting him on a pedestal right now. Thank you for your sacrifice to the occult cause. You see, here's what makes your Hiro Yamato's and your Tom Morello lectures, here's what makes them so fake, is that they'll spend all this time lecturing you on like the oppressed, brown people and things like this, and Native Americans and Leonard Peltier and all this, but their own band member, who they supposedly love, they won't open up the investigative report and talk about the fact that the media is straight up lying about what's in there, and that what the medical examiner is saying is contradicting what a detective is saying is what an eyewitness who arrived on the scene is saying. They've got all of this energy to dig into like Leonard Peltier, but they don't have that same energy to dig into their own bandmate and friend that they supposedly love. They don't have the energy to dig into that rabbit hole. And that right there shows you how fake it all is. These people, they're full of shit. They're just actors. I don't know who's telling them what to say. They can feed it to me with the nicest shit-eating grin they want, but I'm not buying it. I just think all these people are playing along because they're all slaves to the industry. And I just pray that something breaks this evil spell and that all the truth comes out. We can see the ugly truth someday of what really happened here and what the reality is of, the entertainment business and how it, the place it occupies in society and how we can maybe change that to something better someday.